Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Today we'll discuss translation traffic between Indian languages. This is a module from literary translation in India. The content of this module is written by Anshika Adhikari, an independent research scholar. K. Sachidanandan, in his article Translating India, writes, with India's plurilingual heritage, translation with its accretions, adaptations, and substitutions was often a reinterpretation of the original. It continues to be a way of having a living dialogue with our past and between our different cultures. Literary translation is an intellectual activity which has been carried on since antiquity and is eminently worthy of celebration. If the practice would not have been begun, we would have remained confined in the shackles of monoculturalism. We would have become the prey of ignorance of various ancient and contemporary heritages and culture. Translated literature are bridge of fresh air which enhance our creative and intellectual ability. European Renaissance began when Greek texts were discovered and translated throughout the continent. Similarly, the discovery of ancient Indian texts by the European scholars, reawakening which opened the doors to rediscover our past. Our one language cannot express the meanings of another. Instead, there is a distinction between the meanings built in and the meanings that must be captured and expressed. In this sense, different languages predispose their speakers to think differently, direct their attention to different aspects of the environment. Translation is therefore not simply a matter of seeking other words with similar meaning, but of finding appropriate ways of saying things in another language. Different languages then may use different linguistic forms, but these forms are only one of the aspects of the difference between the two language systems. Duracell Salvador in 2005 says, the centrality of translation in India and in general in multilingual and multicultural places is a matter of fact, and plurilingual writers creating either in the language of the ex-colonizer or in the regional languages are challenging and redefining many accepted notions in translation theory. Unquote. Now let us talk about translation in India. India, being an abode to thousands of languages and various cultures, is a microcosm of the globe. Therefore, translation plays a huge and an important role in the exchange of various cultural and linguistic knowledge. India is linguistically fragmented, and translation becomes the main daily communicative medium. Multilingualism is all-pervading in the subcontinent, where more than 1,600 languages are spoken and 18 are recognized in the constitution. In India, after all, pluralism is organic and translation is an inevitable way of life. Seen in this light, it is not surprising that India has a rich tradition of translation theory and practice. Sujit Mukherjee in 1981 he wrote a book where he believes that translation occupies a natural place and plays a pivotal role in the literary sphere and daily speech of the country. Indeed, Devi in 1997 and 1999 posits that Indian literary traditions are essentially traditions of translation, while G. Gopinathan in 2000 posits that literary translation in India since ancient times has never been considered something different in kind from creative activity. Also, from a broader vantage point, Devi believes that in post-colonial spheres, many literary traditions have their genesis in acts of translation. In this view, there are communities such as the Indian that possess what he names translating consciousness, which exists in multilingual places where a dominating colonial language has acquired a privileged status. Though this does not mean the negation of the different indigenous languages, nor their communicative and creative possibilities and functions. Nonetheless, in spite of the constant presence of translation in Indian reality, as Shantha Ramakrishnan has put forward, in India there is no explicit and well-defined policy of translation, which obviously should be part of broad linguistic planning. In any case, though there is much to be done, it is worthwhile mentioning the existence of some projects in this respect, such as the translations published by the Sahitya Academy. The practice of translation of Indian literature from one Indian language to another can be traced back to several translations of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and Bhagavad Gita. These translations also included the tribal versions and performative improvisations. Not only that, stories of Panchatantra traveled to the west and became famous with the name of Aesop's fables. The importance of translation can be understood from the point that if Gora or Khasakinte Itihasam or Maila Achal would not have been translated into other Indian languages, then they would have remained closed rooms to us. In order to conduct an activity of translation, a translator must learn new languages. Translation is thus a necessary process in the very training of literary translators. A routine learning route for students of both classical and modern languages. Literary translation is thus an activity that is both technical and creative. A translator must definitely strive be as accurate as possible, but the reincarnation of a text should be affected in the text. Translated culture is the key which bridges different cultures and brings people of different communities together. Leticia Herrero in 2005 mentions that translation is presented as a product in itself, that is, as a book which is not an original but rather comes from an original. From the very first glance, the reader finds signs indicating the importance given by the promoters of this project to translation as a process of widening the borders of Indian culture. The only way to let Western people look inside the Tamil culture is through the rendering of it into a major language like English, and thus translation plays an essential role. Therefore, whereas in translated editions it is a rather unusual practice to advertise the fact that a book is a translation. In this work, the reader is informed from the very first moment from the book cover that it is indeed a translation into English from a Tamil original. In addition, the series logo, a symbolic T for translation, highlights the importance the editors want to give to translation as a useful tool in the diffusion of cultures. Unquote. The things which a translator has to wrestle most are the idioms and proverbs of the source language. If there are parallels between the source and the target language, there is no difficulty. But then, many a time, such parallels do not exist. What happens is that when two different languages come together, the idioms of the one enter into the stream of another. But then it is found that it is the richer of the two languages that supplies idioms to the less developed ones. When Persian was the state language during the Mughal period, it supplied a number of idioms to Hindi. Learning each other's language is one of the most precious tasks in the world, and in our age, one of the most pressing tasks in this diverse multilingual subcontinent. There should be a great expansion in language learning facilities in schools and universities so that there can be more and more direct translation between the languages without relying on a linked language. Sadly, the educational system favored by the Indian middle classes, with its overwhelming emphasis on the acquisition of English, does not favor this process. The overall trend seems to be to translate from the native Indian languages into English, a process which does not allow the different Indian literatures to influence each other directly, while translation spreads information about the source language, letting others know what riches it possesses. It enriches the recipient language. If Telugu literature is translated into Punjabi, it makes that literature accessible to the readers who can read Punjabi and disseminates information about the Telugu literary heritage. Cultural meanings are intricately woven into the texture of the language. The creative writer's ability to capture and project them is primary importance for and should be reflected in the translated work. Caught between the need to capture the local color and the need to be understood by an audience outside the original cultural and linguistic situation, a translator must be aware of both cultures. One of the main goals of literary translation is to initiate the target language reader into the sensibilities of the source language culture. The process of transmitting cultural elements through literary translation is a complicated and vital task. Culture is a complex collection of experiences which condition daily life. It includes history, social structure, religion, traditional customs, and everyday usage. This is difficult to comprehend completely, especially in relation to a target language. One important question is whether the translation will have any readership at all, as the specific reality being portrayed is not quite familiar to the reader. A name is a linguistic cultural element, and an author uses it for its associative value. It resists translation, therefore its evocative value is lost. It becomes extremely difficult to maintain a balance between two Indian languages. The main concern of the translator is the choice of his or her priorities from among the form, registral features, meaning, sense, emotions, and images while deciding upon a or faithful recreation. A daily conversational language does not open different windows of interpretation. At a poetic language is filled with various imageries, concepts, figures of speech, and symbolic nuances. It is also suggestive and allegorical too. It is colored with notions which can be traced to the social, cultural, and in some cases personal context. While translating them, the translator has to remodel the context to facilitate understanding by the target language audience. Language is a culture-bound phenomena. It exists in the cultural and historical perspectives of the users and has a whole tradition associated with it. A rendition of culture-specific words, religious customs and ceremonies, poetic fancies, mythological allusions, archetypal images, and philosophical context therefore become problematic. The peculiarities of a nation's mental makeup too unwittingly influence the work of translator. Problems in translation of literature arise because it cannot be dealt with at the single level. Strict adherence to all the basic principles of translation at the same time is a Herculean task. The translator has to erase his or her identity from a product of his own workmanship, which is an onerous task in itself. At the same time, he or she has to infuse his or her work with the spirit and soul of the original. He or she has to delve in the psychology of the poet and relive the experience and emotion of the author at the instant of creation. He or she has to reproduce faithfully the form and registral features besides capturing the effusive quality so characteristic of a literary work and weaving it into an equally mesmerizing pattern in the target language. He or she has to preserve all the necessities of the language of the original while ensuring that the secondary meaning is adequately expressed. Add to this the cultural and historical perspectives, orientation of the target language audience, and the problems involved in a convincing rendition of culture-specific words, religious customs and ceremonies, poetic fancies, mythological allusions, archetypal images, and philosophical context. And the problems of the translator multiply exponentially. In the context of India, the most common problems faced by the translators comprise of peculiar construction of grammar, particular cultural references, dialect-specific terms, etc. Still, some of the chief problems which are faced when a translator translates from one Indian language to another, and the problems are: 1. A particular word in one language often contains meanings that involve several words in another languages. Grammatical particles, verb, tense, singular, dual, plural, case markers, etc. are not available in every language, and idioms of one language and culture may be utterly perplexing to speakers from another language and culture. Sapir in 1956 says, "No two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached." Unquote. Translation can be said to deserve a credit for integrating the populace universally. As we know, a literary text is an instance of human emotion and its enchantments. Moreover, it should not be restricted to by social, cultural, and geographical boundaries. The language can be a geographical phenomena, but emotions are universal. For this integration, translation acts as an agent of homogenization of emotions, tries to attain universality of human emotions to a considerable extent. The importance of translation as an effective means of communication in the Indian literary scene is thus established beyond doubt. One language cannot express the meanings of another. Instead, there is a distinction between the meanings built in and the meanings that must be captured and expressed. In this sense, different languages predispose their speakers to think differently, different their attention to different aspects of the environment. Translation is therefore not simply a matter of seeking other words with similar meaning, but of finding appropriate ways of saying things in another language. Different languages then may use different linguistic forms, but these forms are only one of the aspects of the difference between the two language systems. Now, let us conclude our discussion. Cultural transfer requires a multi-pronged approach. It is concerned with the author's relationship to his subject matter and with the author's relationship to his reader. This should be reflected in a good translation. The translator must transmit this special cultural quality from one language to another. Most translations are intended to serve, however imperfectly, as a substitute for the regional, making it available to people who cannot read the language in which it was written. This imposes a heavy responsibility on the translators. Awareness of history is an essential requirement for the translator of a work coming from an alien culture. Thorough knowledge of a foreign language, its vocabulary, and grammar is not sufficient to make one competent as a translator. One should be familiar with one's own culture and be aware of the source language culture before attempting to build any bridge between them. If the reality being represented is not familiar to the audience, the translation stumbles and becomes difficult to read. The translator would have to consider whether similar or parallel language resources exist in the literary subculture of the target language. In translation of a culture rich in literature, the question of relevance to the projected audience is more significant to the translator than to the original author. A translator has to look for equivalence in terms of relevance in the target language and exercise discretion by substituting rather than translating certain elements in a work. Even with all the apparent cultural hurdles, a translator can create equivalence by the judicious use of resources. Translation is an intellectual activity that will continue to thrive, deriving inspiration from fiction in the source language and passing on such inspiration or at least appreciation to target language readers. Kannan Sundaram in 2016 says, while translation between Indian languages is promoted by National Book Trust and Sahitya Akademi, and undoubtedly they have made a remarkable contribution in the field, publishers need to be encouraged to publish translations. Translations must be as broad-based as possible, tuned to pollinating as many languages as possible, so that we have a better and richer understanding of our composite culture. I unquote. Though, as Shashi Tharoor in 2001 has beautifully stated, as long as translations exist, language is a vehicle, not a destination. In the case of translated Indian text, the vehicle and the destination become one. The authors imbue their creative forms with their own cultural translation, showing that in spite of losses or concessions to the target languages, the communicative gain is important. And translingual, transcultural aesthetic production is possible. Above all, it signals intercultural aesthetic translatability. Though we know that cultural differences are not always translatable and can remain dramatically distinct. As Goethe observes, there are two principles of translation. The translator can bring to his fellow countrymen a true and clear picture of the foreign author and foreign circumstances, keeping strictly to the original, but he can also treat the foreign work as a writer treats his material, altering it after his own taste and convictions, so that it is brought closer to his fellow countrymen, who can then accept it as if it were an original work. Unquote. Now, let us summarize our discussion. The traffic between Indian languages. It is very difficult to get translators having competency in more than one Indian languages. except than few pairs. We can have translator from Hindi to Bangla, from Hindi to Telugu, from Telugu to Hindi, from Marathi to Hindi to Marathi. But the problem is with the getting competent translator with having knowledge in both the languages. But as we have access to Indian language and English too, so most of the translation of Indian literature happens from Indian language into English, and in some cases, or in most of the cases, from English to Indian languages. But we can overcome this problem with taking a method for translating Indian literature, as Navanita Devshen took a method while she was translating Kannada Vachana from Kannada into Bengali. First, a Kannada scholar transliterated the Kannada words into Roman script, and he wrote English words for each Kannada word which is transliterated into Roman. Then Navanita Devshen translated those English words into Bengali, and as the Vachana already transliterated into Roman script, Navanita Devshen as a translator easily understood the rhythm of the language, the rhyme of the language. She understood, and she reorganized, she recreated the English words or English equivalences into Bengali, and she tried to keep the essence and the rhythm of Kannada language. So this is one of the ways through which the translation between Indian languages can happen. There are few more examples in such way. Sahitya Akademi, when translates any oral or folk text from any alien or marginal language into some official language, Sahitya Akademi quite often takes this kind of methodology. In this module, we have discussed the translation methodology, we have discussed problem of translation, we have discussed what is the responsibility of the translator in the very context of multilingual, multicultural country like India, where gradually the idea of Indian literature is widening, the scope of Indian literature is widening, and in numerous translation of Indian Bhasha literature into English or other Indian literature or other Indian languages have been happening. So we have discussed all these issues, and specifically we have focused on the multilingual country India and the necessity of translation, the tradition of translation, what have been already there in the Indian culture, Indian literary history, and what are the problems of translation in this context. For further reading, you can see the read more list, and to get to know more about this discussion, you can consult the e-text. Thank you.